To discuss this week's events, I'm joined by three members of Parliament from the different parties. Erin O'Toole is a Conservative member for the riding of Durham and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Mike Sullivan is the NDP MP for the Ontario riding of York South Weston. And Scott Andrews is the Liberal MP for the Newfoundland riding of Avalon. All three of you, welcome and thanks for taking the time. I know several of you are going back to your ridings this weekend. Let's talk about Wednesday. You were all involved in a lockdown on Parliament Hill. In different places in the Hill. Can we just ask what exactly happened? And 2 days later, what stands out to you? Erin O'Toole, you were in the government caucus room. You were locked down. What stands out thinking about it 2 days later?
Well, I think a lot of us, not just parliamentarians, but staff on the Hill, media, will be processing this a lot over the weekend. It was a very traumatic time. What I'll remember vividly, Martin, is I stand as a rookie. I didn't ever want to take somebody's seat in caucus because they're all creatures of habit. They have their seat. So I've been standing at the back of the room by the door facing the Hall of Honor. And after the first shot, when people were startled and then wondering, and then you heard more, the Prime Minister was speaking to our caucus. So he was at the podium at the front of the room, and I remember looking at him and the look in his eyes and probably my eyes of people trying to sort of say what exactly is happening, and then the realization that there was an attack or some sort of violence on essentially the other side of that door. That's something that will be with me, and then the reaction of many people in that room, and of course we relied on the law enforcement expertise to make sure a terrible situation did not become far worse. So you saw people stepping up to help their colleagues and friends inside that room, not just during the incident, but through the whole day. And you've seen people throughout Centre Block, from the guards that help us right through to all the staff. We've all been appreciating each other a little more this week. Yeah,
I want to ask something. There was, just as an illustration, as a graphic illustration, there were reports that in your caucus that people were actually taking down the flags and preparing. We know that in several of both rooms on both sides of the hallway, people barricaded the doors, but people were actually taking down flags and preparing to, if need be, to use them, the flagpoles to counterattack if anyone should try and break in.
Well, what happened, Martin, in this situation, it was just chaos. And so after the succession of fire, and everyone knew there was some sort of attack, and there was a report that came into the room from security that there was someone in the library. And then word was there's more than one person. And so it was just confusion. Yeah. And so there was a real fear that there's very few people in the library, particularly on caucus mornings. But very meters away, there's two rooms with hundreds or 200 people in them. So the instinct a lot of people had was to try and barricade the doors. The challenge was, though, Martin, is the doors opened the other way. So the chairs, we locked the doors. The chairs were put up really just to make it impossible to enter the room really quickly. But then the flags, people sort of improvised, and the flags were used so that some of us were standing at the sides of the doors in case that door did open. There was a real fear that at the time there was more than one person, that they might go from the library into one of the nearby rooms. So you just saw instincts kick in, and that's where the flags, ironic, the symbols of Canada were taken and used to make us ready for repelling an attacker. Yeah. Thankfully, there was nobody that did come in.
Mike Sullivan, you, the NDP caucus was on the other side of the hallway, in the other big caucus room that was there. You were locked down and then eventually transferred to another room when that room they were secured. What are your thoughts about this? What are your feelings? What do you retain 2 days later?
I don't want to ever live through that again. It was the most frightening experience I've ever had to be through. It was. We heard what sounded like a clattering because the doors on our caucus room are padded and for soundproofing, and so those doors muffled some of the sounds. And suddenly, after that clattering, the House of Commons security guard came through the door and locked it. Closed it's a double door, one opens out, one opens in, closed the inner door, and then said, close all the doors, block them, there's a gun. And at that point, we all, panic set in to a little bit, but then we started laying tables in front of the doors. Luckily, our doors open inwards, so tables actually were going to stop them. And then we just put our backs up against all the big stone walls and prayed that whatever was going on out there wasn't going to find its way into our caucus room.
There was a photo that was published yesterday. A journalist snapped a picture of your door, the door to your meeting room, and a bullet had gone through the first layer, the first door, and then had hit the second door, the padded door, and it was stopped by that door.
And the security guard who came in and stood in front of that door, had it gone through the second door, he was in the line of fire.
Yeah. What do you retain of it?
One of the interesting things about what happened through that day is that time has ceased to have a meaning. I really couldn't tell you what time things happened throughout the day. We went from being terrified in our caucus room to suddenly being escorted down the halls very quickly and quietly, and somehow confusion took place because 13 of our members ended up outdoors accidentally and could not get back in. And then we were led into a small meeting room in the basement of the East Block. And we kind of wondered, why are we here? This room is full of windows. You start to feel less secure when you're not surrounded by all the stone of this building. But the police obviously knew what they were doing. The security forces knew that they were leading us to a place that was safer than what was going on in Center Block, and they wanted us out of Center Block. They wanted us into a room that they could control, into an area they could control. So we spent the next 4 hours on the floor of that room. Because we all were told to be below the windows.
Yeah, sitting there like almost like a daycare or something,
yeah, it seems like it. It was quite surreal, and time didn't seem to have any meaning because we were just waiting for the next announcement from the security forces who came to our door. And our leader, Tom Mulcair, was there with us, and though they offered to take him out and get him someplace off the hill, he elected to stay with us. Because that's what he felt was the right thing to do.
Scott Andrews, we spoke with several of your colleagues the day of the attack on Wednesday, and several of them had already left the caucus, so they weren't trapped in the lockdown on the Hill, John McKay, for example. But you were meeting in a lower level, on the lower level, another meeting room, which the Liberals used for your caucus meeting. What do you retain? What sticks out 2 days later in your memory of those events?
Well, our day starts a little different. Unlike the Conservatives and the NDP caucuses start, if I believe, at 9:30. Our national starts at 10 o'clock, and our regional caucus is finish up around 9:45. Right. So a lot of our members were in the process of coming to our national caucus meeting. They were breaking up from the regional caucuses, and they were in transition to the basement of Center Block, where we have our caucus meeting for 10 o'clock. So we weren't all together as a group. We were somewhat scattered over the Center Block, and in my case, I missed the regional caucus, and I was about to head from the Justice Building to Center Block. So my experience is a little different because we were 2 or 3 buildings. I was personally removed from the event. What I retain from this particular day is, every time we walk up to Parliament Hill, it's sort of always in the back of your mind. You're looking around, you realize you're public figures, and you see the security that's around, and you always wonder when something may happen. And unfortunately, this was the day something did happen. So you sort of retain that, when you come to work here, you realize you are a public figure, and you are somewhat of a target. So, you do watch where you're stepping, where you're coming into the building, and you're very conscious, I am at least, about your surroundings and where you're to. So that's sort of what I retain from this day.
Mm-hmm. I'll go down all 3 of you, start with you, Aaron. Obviously, you're all asking yourselves, how can we make our workplace more secure, given that you are public figures? This has now happened, and this is the first actual open, brazen attack with a gun into the Center Block. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, first, Martin, I think I speak for all 3 of us that we're really deeply appreciative for the Hill Security, RCMP, our Sergeant-at-Arms, Kevin Vicker. It could have been much worse.
Right.
But now is the time to take lessons learned from this and try and see how we can make this place safer for not just the parliamentarians, but the people that work here and support our work, without this becoming a lockdown entirely. I think everyone wants to make sure that we find a balance between making sure it's secure and people are safe, but that Canadians can come and see their democracy in action. I said this week that this was an attack on the heart and soul of Canada, the heart of our democracy here in Centre Block, and our soul at the National War Memorial. Canadians still need to visit these sites and be part of it. These are Canadian institutions, and that's why the attack, and particularly the death of Corporal Cirillo, who will be on the Highway of Heroes this afternoon, is so tragic. These are Canadian institutions, so we have to find the balance between improving security based on what we need to from this terrible incident, but still making sure that Canadians can visit these places, because it's important that they do that.
Okay, I'm going to make this question harder as it goes along the line because you all agree with that, the balance of security versus access. Okay, Mike Sullivan, and then to you, Scott Andrews. Is there anything that jumps to mind, though, about how to prevent someone from getting all the way into the Centre Block with a long gun?
I'm not the expert on how to prevent bad things happening.
Yeah.
In hindsight, one can see what happened. It took 1 minute and 23 seconds for him to get from Wellington Street into the building.
Yeah, you've watched that RCMP video, which we're seeing on our screen right now. Yeah.
And so that indicates to me that there are points of access to this building that are not as secure as they could be, and so I'll leave it up to the security experts to figure out how to make those points of access more secure. The public access already is very secure, so that when members of the public access this building, they have to go through a rigorous set of screening, much like an airport, where everything is checked. The doors that were breached were doors that only trusted individuals are allowed into. And clearly that individual was not a trusted individual, and burst through a door and shot somebody on the way in. And that person he shot is somewhat of a hero himself for having slowed the man down long enough to let the other security forces be able to corral him. Yeah. So it's as was said, it's a balance. I don't want us to become an institution that is closed off to the public.
Scott Andrews, I've got to go to you. We're running out of time. Any thoughts? Anything that just jumps to your mind?
Yeah, well, one thing that jumps to my mind is, like, if any of us have ever come into the Senate entrance to this building, you actually have to get buzzed in. Like, it's a secure door. Okay. You can't just go up and come right in through the front door. So maybe that's something we need to look at on the main entrance and the members' entrance. But that doesn't answer the question for the outside and protecting the public at large and protecting members who are walking to this place. So I think that'll all be reviewed as we move forward in the coming weeks and months ahead. Okay,
a last question to you, Aaron O'Toole. We have not even had time to touch on the other aspect of security, which is really the pan-Canadian aspect, and that is the forces. The forces are very much a target, as we saw on Monday with the attack in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and then, of course, the corporal who was killed at the War Memorial. The Chief of Defence Staff has asked forces members not to wear their uniforms except going to and at work. One of your MP colleagues, Aaron O'Toole, John Williamson, has said he doesn't agree with that decision. He thinks that forces shouldn't back down. If you guys in Parliament can be back to work the next day, that the forces shouldn't be abandoning their uniforms in public. The CDS obviously thinks it's a security matter. What do you make of it?
Listen, as someone that wore the uniform, Martin, I know the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces are very proud to wear their uniform. The government trusts implicitly the decisions of General Lawson and the Canadian Forces leadership to decide how best to serve and protect their members. And if for some time that means curtailing wearing your uniform outside of your work and your duty hours, we support them in that decision. What's most troubling here is Warrant Officer Vincent and Corporal Cirillo weren't attacked for who they are. They were attacked for what their uniform represents and the values. And that's deeply troubling, and it's a strike at our institutions. So while we're getting a handle on this, particularly after a tragic week where we lost two of our own, if the Canadian Forces feels this is prudent going forward for a period of time, we fully support them in that. And we're going to work with them to make sure that we have security on bases and that our men and women don't face risks in their own home.
Okay, on that note, we are out of time. I want to wish all three of you a quiet, peaceful, restful weekend. I want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Thank
Mark.
you.
Cheers.